Thank you. And good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this expert panel on internet shutdowns and how to stop them. This panel is presented by the Internet Society chapter in DC, so ISOC-DC, and the Internet Society New York chapter, ISOC New York, in collaboration with Access Now. My name is Chelsea Horne. I'm a senior professorial lecturer at American University, and I'm also co-convenor of the ISOC-DC chapter. So the way that this panel is going to work is I'm going to introduce all three of our expert panelists, who will then take about 15 to 20 minutes to present on their respective reports and projects. Then we'll wrap up with some moderated questions between myself and the panelists. And then we will leave time at the end for questions from the audience. But I would love to solicit those as we go along, and then we'll go through them as they come in at the end of the session. So please ask your questions as you have them, and we'll collate them and ask them at the end. So our first presenter is Natalia Krapiva, who leads Access Now's efforts to strategically engage courts and legal processes to uphold digital rights. Natalia is licensed by the State Bar of New York in USA. Prior to Access Now, Natalia worked as a prosecutor at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Our second presenter is Joan Barata, who works on freedom of expression, media regulation, and intermediary liability issues. He is a fellow of the Program on Platform Regulation at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. His work has taken him in most regions of the world, and he is regularly involved in projects with international organizations such as UNESCO, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where he was a principal advisor to the representative on media freedom. Our third and final panelist is Dan York, who is the Director of Internet Technology, where he analyzes and reports on internet shutdowns for the Internet Society's Pulse platform. He previously led projects around technical communities, low Earth orbit satellites, and open internet standards, including TLS, DNS, SEC, IPv6, and routing security. He has been active in the Internet Engineering Task Force, and prior to joining the Internet Society in 2011, he spent over 10 years working with voice over IP security. He has been working with online communication technologies since the 1980s and is the author of multiple books on networking, security, IPv6, and Linux. And finally, I wish to give a big thank you to Jolly McPhee for his support with the live streaming, backroom work, and the recording of this panel session. So now I'll go ahead and pass it over to Natalia, who will tell us about her very recent report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Well, it's not my report, it's a report of Access Now and a Keep It On coalition. I did participate in the drafting. It was a lot of hard work, but of course, I think the biggest credit goes to the communities, Keep It On partners, and the communities on the ground who have been documenting the internet shutdowns that took place last year in 2023. I'm going to share with you our most important findings and analysis in a second. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it will work, right? So again, my name is Natalia Krapiva. I'm a senior technical counsel at Access Now. I primarily lead our legal, sort of tech legal work, litigation, but I'm also involved in various aspects of our work, including on the work on shutdowns. And I'm going to present today the report that we just published, that we put out regularly about the state of internet shutdowns in the world, and this is for last year. So, but first I wanted just to give a very brief overview of what is a Keep It On, what is a Keep It On coalition, what do we do? Keep It On coalition is a global campaign that was launched at RightsCon, which is a conference that we also put out every year. It was in 2016. And Access Now has been leading this campaign, but it's really, there's more than 300 civil society organizations that are part of this campaign, and from more than 100 countries around the world. And what do we do? Keep It On campaign prevents internet shutdowns. We do track important events, for example, such as elections. And this year is a historic year in terms of the amount of elections that we have. We do outreach to states, governments, companies, telecommunication providers, and ask them not to shut down internet, not to facilitate internet shutdowns. We explain to them also the consequences, the harms of shutdowns. And in some cases, we have been able to actually show where we prevented the shutdowns from occurring. We also advocate against shutdowns. We talk about what they do, the harms that they do, the financial, economic, human costs and harms. We also monitor shutdowns, and we use our stop tracker, which is actually a public. You can see it yourself, the methodology that we use to track internet shutdowns. We also provide, through our digital security helpline, we provide also digital security support, where we provide advice on circumvention tips and so on, how to circumvent shutdowns. We also use strategic litigation, which I'm going to talk about in the end, to fight internet shutdowns. And then, of course, RightsCon is our yearly conference where Keep It On was launched, and every year we also gather and discuss trends and gather international support for our work. This year, actually, we had to skip RightsCon, but next year it will take place in Taiwan in February 2025. So back to our report. This is called Shrinking Democracy, Growing Violence, Internet Shutdowns in 2023. I'm going to talk about the methodology with the shutdowns definitions that we use, then provide sort of a global overview and talk about the triggers and trends that we noticed, and then the regional snapshots, and then the legal advocacy discussion. So when we talk about internet shutdowns, what do we mean? We came up with this definition in 2016 together with other stakeholders, and this definition has been the same, but we constantly discussing and updating, trying to see whether actually it needs updating. But as of right now, and this is a definition that has been relied on by in UN reports and other multilateral bodies, and has been quite widely adopted. So internet shutdown is defined as an intentional disruption of internet or electronic communication. So it can't be just accident. It has to be an intent. It can be some third party imposing shutdown. When it comes to the government, we have to see the intent to actually impose a shutdown, rendering these communications inaccessible or effectively unusable for specific population or within a location, often to exert control over the flow of information. So this is also has to do with both full shutdowns, sort of full blackouts, but also throttling communication, making it so slow that it's essentially impossible to get connection, even if there's some connectivity, but the basic functions are disrupted. So again, it's when internet access is completely or blanketly shut down, and also slowed, degraded, or throttled. And we also talk about blocking access of two-way essential communication platforms, whether that's Facebook, X, Instagram, or Telegram. This is important because, as you know, in some countries, these platforms are what the internet is, because especially in many authoritarian states, governments often block websites, news websites, independent sources, even government services are restricted. And so these platforms remain the only sources of independent information, of secure communications, and so on. And so blocking these platforms essentially deprives individuals of the most important basic functions of the internet. So now to overview. So what we have seen is, unfortunately, the rise of internet shutdowns in 2023. Since 2016, we have been documenting overall a steady growth, although with COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, we have seen a slowdown, small decrease in shutdowns. There may be many reasons. We do think part of it can be because of restrictions, protests. There was a lot of restrictions against protesting, public events, and so on, which is when shutdowns often happen. Schools were also online, so it is not something that and as the internet was more important, everybody had to rely on it even more. So perhaps that could explain it. But then, unfortunately, it picked up again, and we have seen in 2023 283 shutdowns compared to last year 201 and 167, not including India. And India, sadly, that remains also a steady country where it is a worst violator when it comes to internet shutdowns. This year, 116 shutdowns. And Myanmar, Iran, Palestine, Ukraine are come next. In Palestine and Ukraine, you see asterisks because those shutdowns were mostly imposed by, in this case, Israel and Russia. So not those countries' governments. Although in Ukraine, we've seen 2 shutdowns imposed by Ukrainian groups such as Ukraine IT Army. So this is a snapshot, but I wanted to also talk about some of the specific triggers or sort of trends that we have seen. Conflicts remain to be, unfortunately, major circumstances within which shutdowns happen. We have seen 74 shutdowns in 9 countries during conflicts. Protests and exams and elections also remain to be key events during which shutdowns happen. And the emerging trend that we have seen is recorded as natural disasters. In 4 countries, we have seen shutdowns used. Either there was an ongoing shutdown during which natural disasters took place that exacerbated the situation of the populations that are already suffering, or we had, such as, for example, in Turkey, where a shutdown was imposed aftermath of the disaster to what is likely to conceal the failed or inadequate efforts by the government to respond to the disaster. Other trends that we're seeing is that the shutdowns are associated, sadly, with grave human rights abuses and violations. We have seen it happening in 11 countries. None of these countries are a surprise for you, so I wouldn't spend too much time, but this is a sad, tragic trend that we are observing. We also observing an increased amount of blocking of social media platforms. What we are seeing is that governments are realizing that having full shutdowns, blockouts actually hurt oftentimes even the government. Their own government services are blocked, banking is blocked, they also cannot use internet. And so they instead elect sort of these selective blockings. And as I said, for many populations, right, these are the only platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and so on. These remain the main sources really of alternative independent information and communication. And so governments would then block these platforms. And Grindr is something that we have discovered is a new trend, that this app, which LGBT communities are using to communicate, it is now being increasingly blocked in 12 countries. We're also recording that number of countries have these extremely prolonged shutdowns, like in Ethiopia, more than 1,000 days shutdown that we are observing, and in Myanmar, also over 800 days, Pakistan, over 600 days, and then 35 countries also still have shutdowns persisting from 2003 into this year. And then we're seeing that the shutdowns are also occurring within larger geographic scopes. So if before we saw a smaller, sort of a larger percentage of this wide-ranging shutdowns, now it has grown, and we see now shutdowns impacting multiple regions or entire countries, which was much less so in past years. And then again, just to give you a snapshot of the platforms that are increasingly being blocked, Facebook, I think the main ones, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, YouTube are not, Instagram are not so surprising, but Grindr is an emerging one. We also see Clubhouse, which I think not so many people use anymore, but in some countries it remains to be an important communication platform, and that makes it a target. And just briefly to talk about the regional, I can't spend too much time, and there's a lot to talk about, but just wanted to highlight sort of the biggest violators in the country. It is something in Africa. Unfortunately, we keep seeing a lot of shutdowns. Ethiopia and Senegal both had 4 shutdowns last year, but we're also seeing other countries shutting down the internet. We're seeing shutdowns during protests, and we're seeing also increasing amount of platform blockings in Africa. Asia Pacific, India, as always, takes the prize. Sadly, Myanmar also had a staggering 37 shutdowns, a lot of which are ongoing. And so this is something that is, remains to be, the region is unfortunately the highest in terms of the shutdowns. Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In Ukraine, Russia imposed 6 shutdowns. Last year it was actually 22, but since Russia forcefully rerouted the internet from Ukraine providers to its own providers, and then the situation on the ground, military-wise, has changed. So it is less shutdowns, but nevertheless, they are just as devastating for affected populations in Ukraine. And then Azerbaijan has also been imposing in the context of war with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh region. And in the Middle East, Iran had the highest number of shutdowns, also not surprising. Palestine, it was due to Israel's government attacks on the infrastructure, and Iraq as well had shutdowns, including during natural disasters, and then the Turkey as well, as you know, as well as Libya, in fact, also had a shutdown during disaster. And just wanted to lastly point out the importance of legal advocacy for fighting internet shutdowns. We have seen quite a good number of successes, victories in courts. I think the ECOWAS court, the Economic Community of West African States Court of Justice, really has had a number of very important decisions in cases of against Gambia, Nigeria, Togo, where the court ruled that internet shutdowns violate international law, they violate a right to freedom of expression, and that they are unacceptable, including blocking of social media platforms such as Twitter. We also have some domestic court victories, and I mean, there's too many to list, but it's from the recent years. We had a good decision in Pakistan this year on Twitter or X shutdown. In Sudan as well, we had twice already court ruled to restore internet access. There was a lawsuit against the telco providers. And it was successful. We also had a case in Zambia. Also, there was a social media shutdown that there was a positive ruling there by the High Court. And I wanted just to highlight there is some ongoing cases, which is one that we are part of. We are part of the coalition. Well, it's not one, it's two cases, but it's based on the same event. This is two cases filed in Kazakhstan after the 2022 blackouts, internet blackouts imposed by the government in Kazakhstan in January 2022 during the mass protests there. And there's two cases filed in Almaty. The plaintiffs are internet users who basically suing the internet providers for asking for compensation for the losses caused by the shutdowns. And just to give you background, the shutdowns were quite intense. It was for about a week, and there was almost complete blackouts, and people were quite frightened. There was violence, so hundreds of people were killed, thousands were arrested. There was a complete information vacuum, and people didn't know what to do. They didn't know that there was violence on the streets, so some people went to buy bread to the store and were shot dead. Some also started, there was a rumors and disinformation spreading, and people started hoarding water. And so just the fact that internet shutdowns are used by governments as an excuse, they say, well, it's to prevent misinformation. But in fact, internet shutdowns contribute to misinformation, as we have seen, and they could turn deadly. And Kazakhstan is one example, and I encourage you to follow these cases. We'll be also updating on our social media about the outcomes of these cases, so we hope to see some positive results. And these are just some resources that you can also check on our website and to learn more about our methods, different explainers and taxonomies and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Natalia. And we'll hold off on the questions until everyone has gone, but I do want to remind our audience that you can use the chat feature now to put in your questions, and then we'll get to them in the order that they're asked at the end of the presentations. So this is an excellent segue to Joan Barata, who is going to be presenting on internet shutdowns and international law. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Joan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. This presentation will be mainly based on a report. It has been mentioned that I produced together with my colleague Andrei Richter from a legal angle, precisely. And this is something that was published by the project at Columbia University, this Global Freedom of Expression project, this special paper collection. So you can read it there. In any case, again, the angle that we'll take is a legal angle from two perspectives. One is to what extent international law standards, human rights standards established by international law give us answers or clear parameters when it comes to internet shutdowns. And here, what we found is that international human rights standards contain general criteria that might be useful to consider and to analyze internet shutdowns, together with decisions from international human rights courts like the regional cases in Africa that were mentioned already. But at the same time, it's hard to find a very clear standard, a binding standard in international law that says that in any case, there's no way an internet shutdown can happen. There's no clear prohibition. There's no clear standard under international law, which makes things, of course, complicated. But we still can use the general principles to address these matters and consider that in almost every single case, an internet shutdown constitutes a violation of the right to freedom of expression. And also, this study contains an analysis of a national case law, relevant case law on internet shutdowns. Some of the most relevant cases have already been presented by the previous speaker. The only thing I would say is that even though these cases are very relevant, very interesting when it comes to protecting freedom of expression, it is also interesting to note that in many cases, there are no clear reference to international law, to international human rights standards. That in many cases, national law is used, national legal standards are used, and there's no clear reference, not always, sometimes there are references, but no clear references to international human rights standards. So, I mean, during this introduction, I tried to share my screen, but it says host has disabled screen sharing. I'm not sure if this can be addressed. That was just because every time I click on here, it says host has disabled. Otherwise, now I'm a co-host. Let's see. Now I can do it. Okay, thank you. Sorry, thank you very much. Let me then share these, which I understand now. It is good. Very good. So here, I mean, we need to understand that from a legal point of view, this belongs to the general debate about the notion of internet freedom, which is understood as the exercise and enjoyment on the internet of human rights, according to international human rights standards. No? So here, within the universe of internet freedom, we'll find universal access to internet, the right to participate in the governance of the internet, and also the issue of net neutrality would also be included in this, again, big package called internet freedom. Here, of course, our focus will be only internet shutdowns. Internet shutdowns basically have to be seen as a tactic used by governments to suppress dissent. And this is the reality of internet shutdowns so far. The previous presentation has already shown where the internet shutdowns take place, what kind of governments are behind them, and under which circumstances these decisions of shutting down the internet were taken. So it is very clear that basically in most of the cases, the main aim is to suppress dissent. However, national authorities, in order to justify internet shutdowns, usually use different, say, public interest concerns, references to public interest or to interests that are in fact included in international law, like public safety, national security, combating hate speech. But basically they affect, periods like issues like examination, elections, public demonstrations, political tensions, conflict zones. Another thing that I think it is important, unfortunately, to keep in mind is that internet shutdowns cannot be solely associated with authoritarian regimes. They have started to happen in a way in consolidated democracies. Why I'm saying this? Because if we look at the telecom regulations in some European countries, laws have introduced the possibility of a kill switch. It's true that in most of the cases, if not all, this system has never been used, but more and more legislators, in case there's some sort of an attack coming from a third country, they want to have all the tools at hand to prevent, let's say, negative consequences. And in some cases, the instrument, the tool that is contemplated is something very close, that can be considered as an internet, at least a partial internet shutdown. On the other hand, we know that, for example, in a country, perhaps the biggest democracy in the world, the United States, there are discussions about shutting down a specific application, a very popular application. And we know that in other cases, in other jurisdictions, this has been considered as a form of internet shutdown, and concerns with regards to the impact on freedom of expression have been raised by not only by courts, but I would say international human rights courts, which is particularly relevant. The definition of internet shutdowns has already been presented here. This is a definition that we can find, for example, in documents elaborated by the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, considered to be measures taken by a government to intentionally disrupt access to or the use of information and communication systems online. Here, the element of the intentionality has already been underscored, and the fact that these internet shutdowns cannot be associated to cases where, let's say, there are technical issues or there's poor internet connection due to infrastructure problems that a country may have, but there is no clear intention from the government. Let's say also governments resorting to throttling bandwidth or limiting mobile services to 2G or the use of circumventing services, these kind of prohibitions. As it was said already, these can also be considered as a form or a partial, in some cases, internet shut. I think that we need to differentiate between internet content restrictions that sometimes are called censorship. These are the restrictions that target specific pieces of illegal content. So these are, for example, orders from judges, from national authorities to block certain types of content, and then ISPs or sometimes online platforms are forced to block certain accounts, certain pieces of content, certain types of content for very specific reasons. These we should call them internet content restrictions. Of course, they are also relevant and problematic in terms of freedom of expression, but also it is important to mention that they need to be studied or considered separately from the issue of internet shutdowns. In a way, we can say that internet shutdowns, in principle, treat all online content as problematic, without making any differentiation, or all the content that is provided by a certain platform as problematic without making any differentiation. What are the main consequences, particularly from a legal point of view, of internet shutdown? Well, they introduce a clear barrier to a principle that at least has been declared by many international organizations, which is the need to guarantee universal access to the internet. States have in principle the political obligation to guarantee high quality, affordable, open and secure internet. And it is obvious that internet shutdowns may challenge this obligation, the fulfillment of this obligation. The second and most important consequence is that internet shutdowns restrict the right to freedom of expression. The courts, for example, the sub-regional courts in Africa, in the case, for example, of Nigeria and Twitter, they said that the right to the internet is an instrumental right for the exercise of the right to freedom of expression. So right to freedom of expression doesn't include as such the right to access to the internet, but the right to access to the internet has an instrumental nature, and therefore limiting the right to access to the internet limits freedom of expression. I would say that, in other words, and if we want to use the language of international standards, internet shutdowns would violate, in many cases, the so-called three-part test. It's true that in some cases, internet shutdowns might be clearly contemplated by a law. So in this sense, they may fulfill the principle of legality, even though in many cases, decisions to shut down the internet are adopted without a law that clearly establishes or let's say validates this option or gives this option to national authorities. Also, in some cases, the cause might be legitimate in the sense that protecting national security is a legitimate interest of the state, but where the real problem exists in most of the cases when it comes to internet shutdowns is the idea of necessity and proportionality. The fact that authorities need to show that shutting down the internet is strictly necessary to achieve the objective of, let's say, for example, protecting national security or securing free elections. And in many cases, it's very difficult to prove that it is necessary to shut down the internet, because in many cases, this is counterproductive. And also proportionality, in the sense that among all the possible measures that could be adopted within a certain context to protect national security or public order, shutting down the internet is not the least intrusive one. There are other options that represent a lesser degree of intervention within the right to the right to freedom of expression. So, and of course, internet shutdowns also obstruct the exercise of a very specific right to the right to access to information. Due to an internet shutdown, citizens cannot have access to certain sources of information, of official public information that now rely a lot on public websites or the accounts of public institutions. If the internet is shut down, the right to access to information on matters of public interest, it is challenged. So freedom of expression, freedom of information, the Council of Europe said that freedom of information applies not only to the content of information, but also to the means of dissemination or hosting, since any restriction imposed on the means of dissemination necessarily interferes with the right to receive and impart information. This is a document from the Council of Europe. It is not the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, but at least it is a document of the Council of Europe that also recognizes this instrumental nature of the right to access to the internet with regards to the right to freedom of expression. When it comes particularly to national security, we said that already, and also the previous speakers, that governments tend to argue that it is important to ban the spread of news about terrorist attacks in order to prevent panic and copycat actions, for example. But it has already been mentioned that maintaining network connectivity may mitigate public safety concerns and help restore public order. Network disruptions often backfire and cause chaos and unrest. Therefore, network shutdowns invariably fail to meet the standard of necessity. There's a specific case that sometimes is mentioned, that what if there's a cyber attack coming from a third country that is compromising the whole network, so we lose control of our national network and we are in the hands because of this cyber attack, we are in the hands of a third party that is committing an act of aggression against us. There now, in such case, a need to shut down the internet. The ITU has contemplated this situation and have said that measures undertaken to protect against cyber attacks must protect and respect the provisions for freedom of expression as contained in international law. So the ITU says that you may adopt certain measures to protect your national networks when there's a cyber attack. These measures may entail introducing certain restrictions, but in any case, you must protect and respect freedom of expression and avoid negative impact on these rights. So I would say that international law and standards on internet shutdowns have elements that take us to condemn this instrument of information control. Indiscriminate and disproportionate restrictions are harmful to the fulfillment of human rights, and they affect not only freedom of expression, but also the right to access to information, as it has been mentioned, and the right of peaceful assembly, for example. Barriers to universal access to the internet also prevent nations from reaching the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That is very, very important. So while restrictions in some cases may aim at protecting internationally recognized legitimate aims, such as national security, public order, the problem is that in practice, this is often vaguely formulated and does not meet the proportionality test. So in order for any internet shutdown to respect these standards, it should be clearly predetermined by law. The law should clearly regulate in which cases, this kind of measure might be necessary. Also, they should be strictly necessary to protect a certain public interest. So it needs to be justified that what is needed in order to address a certain situation, I don't know, a genocide, the only possibility is to stop the certain services, but these would happen in extremely extreme cases, but let's put it this way, if any. And also the idea of proportionality. If there's any other measure that can be taken to address the situation, even a very serious crisis or emergency that have a lesser impact on the right to freedom of expression, these are the measures that need to be adopted, not shutting down the internet. In other cases, also the problem is that in many countries, the authority that is competent to shut down the internet sometimes is not the judiciary, not clearly established by law. So this creates, opens the door to arbitrariness. So I think that from a legal point of view, you see that basically the conclusion is the same as the conclusions presented by the previous presenter, and it is obvious that from a legal point of view, the implications, particularly in terms of human rights, are very important, and therefore it is also. I think I commend the efforts made by different organizations to take internet shutdowns to courts, so that we have a solid case law that clearly shows governments anywhere in the world that this is not the decision. These are not the decisions to take. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joan. So as we segue to our third and final presenter, who is Dan York, I just wanted to do a quick reminder for those of you who have just joined us that we are collecting questions in the chat. As you can see, we already have the beginning of a robust discussion. We'll get to those at the end of the presentations. And continue to invite you to ask your questions in the chat. So now moving on to our third and final presenter, Dan, could you take it away, please?
Sure, glad to do so. Thank you for having me and for this session that's here. So I want to talk a little bit more about how a resource the Internet Society has called Pulse, our Pulse website, and a bit about what we're doing there. I will put in the chat. Let me just get in there. You can go if you'd like to see some of the information that I'll be talking about, the links that you can learn more a bit about there. But when we look at shutdowns, part of what we've all been talking about is the impact that they have to people and to the parts that are going on around there. And this is just some of the social media pieces, the things we've seen around some of the more recent shutdowns that are there. And this is some of what we see. So on the Pulse website, we specifically have an area focusing around global internet shutdowns. What's going on, where they're happening, what can do. You can go there, you can see a map of where there are current shutdowns. You can also see a history, which if you look right now, you will see there's a lot of shutdowns coming out of Iraq, Syria, and Algeria, because this is exam season. And they have this situation where they go and they turn off the internet for the entire country in order to stop people from cheating at high school exams. And this is one of those kind of areas that we see. When we look at the shutdowns we've seen, and this sort of, we are a member of the Keep It On Coalition and, greatly supporting all the work that Access Now has been leading around that. And when we look at the things we're seeing in terms of the individual shutdowns that we're tracking in this area, so much of it is exam related, and then also government action in some form, and it all comes down to protests and this. We are focused on internet disruptions caused by governments. So we're not tracking outages, we're tracking shutdowns in some form. As Natalia mentioned earlier, this is a big year for elections. There's been an enormous number of them coming on so far, and we've seen different shutdowns. We've been maintaining a shutdown tracker that has been looking at the risk of the shutdowns. We've also been going and tracking whether those shutdowns have happened. We've created incident pages that document what goes on in those different cases. For those who are interested, we do have some methodology around this that is involved with predicting the impact. We have a site, a piece called the Net Loss Calculator, which looks at the economic impact that can potentially have. And I'll come back at the end about a very successful usage of this most recently. But we estimate the amount that will be lost by having the internet shut down for this period of time. That's both in terms of the impact to the GDP, but also the impact to potential investment. This is one of the points that certainly was being made in the recent rounds by people in Iraq, Syria, and Algeria saying, look, we're trying to build a digital economy here. We're trying to go and do this, but then you're deciding to go and shut down the internet in order to prevent cheating on high school exams. So this tool is one of the pieces that we have when we talk about how do we stop shutdowns. Making this case economically is one that we use and that others are using to help advance this cause. We have a risk calculator as part of that you can go and see. And for those who want to get into this, there's a whole methodology we have around estimating the risk, and you can see that in the net loss calculator when we calculate the risk around this. These are pieces that people on the research side may find more useful or interesting. We also spend a good bit of time talking about resilience, and we have a whole section with what we call the Internet Resilience Index, where we look at what is the resilience of individual countries. We point one here back in August 2022. Kenya had a very transparent election. There were worries about some of whether there'd be kind of any shutdowns or outages. But when you look at what their country report is, the resilience for Kenya, it's very high. There are many different retail ISPs. There's very much linkages to other countries. It is a very high resilience score. This is all part of what we see from our reports and pieces like this. In contrast, we see in other countries that have had more internet shutdowns, such as Pakistan, you can see there's a much lower resilience score. There's a much lower piece. We also saw this in Comoros as well, that we're seeing this kind of piece. So these are some of the tools we have to help people understand why are there internet shutdowns happening in these particular countries. Some of it is if you have very few options for ISP, internet service providers, I should say, in a various country, then it's easy for the governments or others to go and control them in some form, in some way. Now, preventing is a challenge. We've talked about, and I heard in the previous presentation, there are repressive regimes, et cetera, who exert more solid control over their infrastructure, who just use internet censorship or shutdowns as mechanisms of control of the population. There's not a lot we can necessarily do in those kind of places. But for countries that are looking at building out a digital ecosystem, that are looking at building up and encouraging investment, working with that, one of the ways that we certainly can help prevent future internet shutdowns is to shine a light on the impact of what's happening. Some of it is on social. There were with the recent rounds of exam-related shutdowns. There were some wonderful cases. Some of the best, of course, had a lot of profanity that I wouldn't want to necessarily put on the slide, but they were people saying, wait, this is 2024. We're trying to build an economy. We're trying to use online services. We're interacting with the government through online pieces. How is it that the government is shutting down the internet? Why? Are there other alternatives? You are costing me money. And this kind of uprising within the media, within social aspects, is certainly part of the ways that we found effectively in recent times to help prevent governments from doing further shutdowns. Again, we mentioned this net loss impact, which is a tool that we've built through a methodology that you can read more about on our site, which provides a mechanism that you can be able to go out in the media or in social media or in direct commentary to governments and say, look, if you shut this down, there's a potential loss, here of, in this particular case, $33 million if you were to have a loss of whatever this particular region is that was looked at here. But it's that kind of arguments that you're able to bring that says, I know you may, to the government that you may want to shut this down to diminish protests, to do whatever else, but it's not going to help you in the bigger picture of where you're looking at. Today, we've actually had a really interesting aspect where there was not a shutdown today. If you've been following anything happening in Kenya right now, it's a very tense situation related to some taxes, a financial document, and a lot of young people in particular are mobilizing and protesting using online services. They're using WhatsApp and Telegram and so many other different services to go and organize. There was a strong rumor, a strong sense that the government of Kenya was going to be shutting off the internet in parts of the country today when another large set of protests were due to happen. But organizations out there, rallied in advance. Access Now and a group of other organizations put out a statement that was there. Our Internet Society Kenya chapter, along with some other organizations, put out a call, and this got picked up in local media. All of these were really putting pressure on the government to make some kind of statement. And the Communications Authority yesterday did put out a press release that basically stated we will not be shutting down the internet. This is the kind of success that happens when you have groups and partners, people in the Keep It On coalition, people in other different groups who are working together as a community to go and raise to the governments the need to have the internet continue, what will happen if it's lost and all of that. And so the success was that the government of Kenya did not shut down the internet today. And that's a wonderful thing. It was on. People who are in the country were definitely reporting that. Now, the situation is still tense there. It will still continue for the next period of time. So we'll hope that the government continues to act in that way and proceed without any kind of shutdowns. But we will continue to see, and at the Pulse site, we will certainly continue to monitor. We will also, one of the ways that we're trying to help prevent this, to answer that question of how do you shut this down, is we're doing seminars with journalists in different parts of the world in the run-up to their elections so that we can help journalists understand what are the tools they can use, what are the concerns about this, so that, again, as we get into that run-up to elections, when there could be chances to go and the government may want to go and shut the internet down in that time, the journalists and local media can help push back against that and provide rationale for why this is a bad decision and should not be done. So that's the quick tour. I'd be glad to talk more about any of all of that, but you can go to pulse.internetsociety.org and see it all yourself. And with that, I'm going to just wrap it up and send it back to you.
Great. Thank you so very much to all three of our presenters. So as another reminder, our session is going until 10:30 a.m. here at Eastern Standard Time. So we have another about 35 minutes. So while I'll ask a few questions and then we'll get to the questions in the chat. So while each of our presenters has either referenced directly a definition of internet shutdowns or referred to something about internet shutdowns, I wanted to get all three of you to discuss a bit more about what exactly is an internet shutdown. What are the different types and classifications? We heard some different language in terms of outages, shutdowns, kill switches, blackouts. direct censorship of either specific accounts, websites. So what exactly is an internet shutdown in the scope of what your project is looking at? What are the different types? And then finally, which do you think is the most pressing? And I'll let you interpret that as you will, as either the most contemporary in terms of urgency, the one that's being missed the most, but which one do you think is the most pressing based off of your projects?
I guess I could start. I mean, I started my presentation with a definition that we use. And I think there was also some confusion in the chat about whether blocking of news websites constitutes a shutdown. Not according to our definition. Blocking of websites, any websites, especially news websites, can in fact constitute a violation of domestic and international law, but it wouldn't be a shutdown. We do, however, include blocking of essential communication platforms, as I was explaining earlier, as they are oftentimes is what pretty much populations have in terms of the internet. In Myanmar, other countries, we have seen where that is famously, right, Facebook is the internet. In Russia, currently, for example, where Russian government has blocked everything, any kind of independent news media, it chased them away from the country. So the only free internet that they have remaining is pretty much YouTube and Telegram, even X and Meta, Instagram and Facebook are blocked. So we do consider those communication, but basically platforms that are used for communication part of a shutdown. But in terms of the most pressing, it's hard to say which one type of shutdown is more pressing. I would point our viewers to this link where we discuss different types of shutdowns. You can see there is various technical ways to enable shutdowns, and the most dangerous out of them is the one that is basically a complete lockdown. It's a fundamental infrastructure shutdown where there is nothing to do to circumvent it, right? You can't use a VPN because there's no internet. So those would be the most dangerous ones, as we have seen, I think in Kazakhstan, for example, that I talked about, although some users did say, in fact, that they had some connection by other providers, but it was very close to a complete shutdown. Similarly, in Belarus during the 2020 protests, and we have seen that in those situations, again, everything fails and people are unable to learn what is happening on the street. They cannot transfer money. They cannot seek safety. They cannot receive any assistance. We are seeing that in Sudan, in situations of extreme violence and conflict. Those are the most dangerous shutdowns. But at the same time, I would just raise lastly that the shutdowns, again, of the platforms, they seem to be, I guess some may view them as more sort of proportionate shutdowns where you only shut down a certain internet social media platform. But again, as I said, especially in countries where people rely on those platforms for communications, those could be also dangerous. And obviously, they also erode even in states like United States right now. Trying to block TikTok, and others, they also are a sign of erosion of democracy and a rule of law in a country. So those are also quite dangerous in our view.
Yeah, if I may, I agree in terms of definition. I mean, and I mentioned that we need to differentiate between blocking content and shutting down the internet. that's one thing. I would say that internet shutdowns affect basically the services that are provided by intermediaries. In some cases, we are talking about intermediaries that are just networks in the sense of ISPs, but in other cases, we're talking about intermediaries that are hosting services like platforms. Therefore, I mean, in order to talk about an internet shutdown is a measure that restricts the dissemination of and access to online content in a way that affects general, I mean, it doesn't affect specific pieces of content that have been identified by those who decide to shut down the internet. It's just something that affects say a non-determined number of pieces of content and users. I think that this is the key element. I would also agree that now some states are trying to whitewash a little bit the notion of internet shutdown, saying, okay, no, we are not shutting down the internet, but we have detected that this application is very dangerous. It's very dangerous for you. It's very harmful. This application disseminates lots of disinformation or puts our country in danger. So the internet is free in this country, but I mean, we need to protect you from this specific application. This is very dangerous, I believe, because it's still shutting down the internet. It's still adopting a measure that is not acceptable, at least from the point of view of human rights standards, and it is something that is being suggested not only by the usual suspects, as it has been said, but by other countries which, in principle, shouldn't be doing this. And the last thing is that I think we need to still incorporate a human rights analysis to this kind of situations. The human rights approach, the kind of international documents that we have are still very broad. They are not 100% clear when it comes to requirements and the things can be done, and to saying that this is not acceptable. And as a consequence of that, at the national level, national courts, sometimes they look into these from the very limited scope of national law. And I've been court decisions that they have declared that an internet shutdown is illegal. So we are all happy about that. But then when you read the decision, they declare it illegal because it was adopted by a body that didn't have the competence to do so. Assuming that if there was a body that was competent, then the judge would have said, okay, that's fine, because you adopted it according to the law. So I think that incorporating this language, this assessment, the importance of internet shutdowns in terms of freedom of expression, this is something that still needs to be understood, particularly by national courts. We have remarkable decisions adopted by sub-regional courts in Africa, as it has been said, but at the national level, we still see lots of hesitancy and lack of understanding from judges about the implications of internet shutdowns.
As I mentioned just dropped in the chat, we have a page that, I mean, to no surprise, we're very much aligned with Natalia because we're part of the Keep It On Coalition and look at shutdowns as an internet disruption of things. I agree. I think one of the challenges that we have right now is that that various different folks are not just shutting down the actual internet. I mean, we are seeing it. Iraq and Syria, for instance, with their exams, are in fact shutting down the internet. In terms of the BGP routing, the stuff that's happening down in the bottom layer of stuff, it's gone. It's cut for that time. But you're seeing in other places, and going back recently here to Algeria, the actual routing of internet packets, IP address related stuff, was continuing. So you could legitimately say the internet was not shut down per se. IP packets still flowed. But the services and pieces on top of that were blocked. And I think Natalia had her list of the various different techniques that are used to do that. And I think we are seeing some governments looking at how else they can do different kinds of things. But to the point of both speakers before, in some countries, the internet, so to speak, it's the user experience, right? And if their user experience is entirely within one platform, we had an issue not too long ago where there was an outage of WhatsApp, right? And it was an outage. It was not a shutdown. But you saw in many countries around the world where their economies were built up on using WhatsApp, that suddenly they could not do just basic functioning of their lives because things were all built into that, using that system. So there's a larger question around resilience of people, of users and people in that area in terms of not being entirely wed to a particular platform or particular system or things that could be blocked. And there's some concentration issues that are of concern and consolidation kind of concerns. But and the point there too is that it becomes that single point of failure, that single point where you can block something, a choke point, where somebody can get in there and go and turn that off, either by outage or by an actual shutdown in some form. Those are the things I think there is a concern that all of us should be thinking about, looking about, is how resilient is our own connectivity? How, what are our connections? What are the systems we use? Are we entirely in one application platform or piece like that? And that sort of goes to that, how do you prevent the shutdowns element in terms of what is our own structures, our own systems, and what is it in each country and pieces that are parts of there? I think we will continue to see more kind of people looking at surgically connecting, trying to remove certain sites or certain pieces. And to Joan's point, do you call that a shutdown when you're specifically targeting one service? It's a service blocking. It's this form of censorship in some form. But yet, if that's the one service that everybody's using in the country, as far as the people are concerned, the internet is shut down. Doesn't matter that on a technical level, it's still there. Their usage, their experience of it is that they cannot get to the internet as they understand it.
And if I can prompt one more thing from what I've heard from your presentations, is that it seems like a key element of internet shutdowns in your definition is intentionality. That the shutdown, it can't be by accident, like a undersea cable being cut, but it has to deal with intentionality. Do you want to speak a bit more to that, or does that capture it?
Well, so I'll speak to that. On our side, on Pulse, we specifically scoped our work that we would focus on intentional disruptions that are caused by government actions in some form. Now, having said that, there are a lot of other things that happen that cause outages in some form. Right now, you're seeing, actually, as the heat has risen in many parts of the world lately with extreme heat, you're seeing outages due to power outages, where entire electrical grids have gone down in some cases because of the excess drawing of air conditioning in the hotter climates of things. So you're seeing outages related to extreme weather, to climate, to pieces like that. You're also seeing outages in war zones. You're seeing outages in other areas that aren't necessarily intentional disruptions by a government. There are other pieces. We scoped our project on focusing around those intentional disruptions purely just because we couldn't, from a practical point of view, cover all of that world. There are other people trying and doing that kind of stuff. So that was how we looked at it.
I would add to that is that, besides referencing the meme of a shark biting off the undersea cable and shutting off the internet, as we learned that apparently it's a very rare situation, and most of the undersea cable accidents are human-made, basically. But again, those are very different from intentional government shutdowns. But when it comes to intent, obviously it's a legal term, right? And that is a hard one oftentimes to prove. Governments are increasingly not taking, or maybe that has been to some extent the case, but I think they're also getting smart and sometimes not really saying directly that they did shut down. Oftentimes there is no law to rely on. And so they kind of try to be very vague about it. But there are ways, again, coming back to the strategic litigation that I talked about, there are ways that in inventive, creative ways, I think, in which we have seen local advocates, international organizations getting actually those orders surfaced, for example, through suing a telecommunication company where the company would say, well, we're not really responsible. We just did what the government ordered us to do, and here is the order. And you can prove, intent that way. There are other ways, but I just wanted to acknowledge that it is a problematic in its own, and oftentimes it's hard. And we have seen cases where we had to take, or we really couldn't prove or show the intent. And in those cases, we kind of acknowledge, yes, there was something, but we can't really count it as a shutdown. And maybe only later it will surface that, in fact, yes, it was the government who did it. So just wanted to acknowledge that wrinkle.
Yeah, and if I can just jump on that one thing too, the attribution. Natalia is right. It's so hard sometimes. It's very rare that you get somebody like Iraq and Syria who have just said, we're going to shut down the internet on these times. And that's the beautiful kind of thing that you can just say from an attribution point of view. It's very clear. Here's the orders. Here's the things that's there. Sometimes that happens, but so often you're dealing with something like a protest or something like that, and it's hard to try to figure out, did the government actually order a shutdown, or is it because you have 100,000 people in one park and they're just overloading the local cell towers, and it's just a technical thing that there is no shutdown. It's just that overcapacity. So getting to that attribution is so difficult sometimes to be able to prove that intentionality. Sorry, Joan, I knew you were about to go.
No. Just wanted to add. I mean, this is very interesting. So thank you. No, I just wanted simply to add that I agree with the fact that we need intention. Because if we are not talking about, if there's no intention, then we're talking about something different. That we should talk about. I mean, the negligence of certain governments and in establishing a proper network, the negligence of certain governments in not properly, say, regulating the telecommunication sector, the negligence of certain governments that may have a monopoly still, a national monopoly still in place, and they let them do whatever they want, and the result is that the internet doesn't work. No, and this is a different problem that needs to be addressed as well. That can be the object of a different conversations. But I think that here, in order to talk about the internet shutdowns and in terms of affecting freedom of expression, having this impact and seen as a way to control political dissent, the element of intention is fundamental. I understand in some cases it's very difficult to find evidence, but still it is still a requirement. The other thing is that now there are some cases where some governments are showing pride because they shut down certain applications. They say, no, you need to be thankful because we liberated you from these, I don't know, let me put it this way, these bad Chinese guys that were hacking your phone. So thanks to us, now you're better off. No, I mean, that is also something that is happening, but particularly when it comes to specific applications. Governments are doing this in public and are trying to justify it as a nice political move. When it comes to general internet shutdowns, usually they tend to try to hide their responsibility.
All right, so we've done the part one of the title of our session, which is what are internet shutdowns? We've got that covered from the perspectives of your respective projects. So now to fulfill the second part, my question is, and you've already hinted at this in your presentations, how do we stop them? So maybe, if in the interest of time, pick one or two different modes of approaches. But let's fulfill that, and then we'll move on to the audience questions. So how do we stop internet shutdowns?
I can go if given that I spoke about that there in my thing. I think really the key parts to me are getting out there and explaining to people why this is a bad thing, right? What's the economic loss? What are the services? What are you trying to do? I think a key part of how we prevent them is providing that public pressure in advance, if we can, and providing that. And we're also seeing people react to the fact that some of the countries in Algeria, a lot of people were questioning, why do we keep doing this? As the digital economy gets more and more connected into that country, it becomes more critical that the internet stays on. And so getting to that economic pressure, getting to that sense that this is going to hurt so many other aspects of what we can do. That becomes part of what I hope puts the public pressure on.
If I may, I may add to this, and I fully agree. I think it is very important to take internet shutdowns to the international sphere, to international organizations, international courts. Of course, the European Court of Human Rights hasn't had the chance because Europe is not, perhaps, so far, it's not a place where this is happening much. But for example, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights so far still hasn't had the chance to have a say in this. Only in Africa we have seen some interesting decisions, but also other international bodies may have a further intervention when it comes to this specific situation that sometimes is not followed as other problems are. So that I think that the internationalization of this matter is important, and I think it is also important to educate governments, to tell them, look, this is bad for you. You're addressing, a situation of crisis, and you think that this way you get rid of dissidents, but generally it doesn't work. It only makes things worse for you. In terms of your reputation, in terms of protests, they will only increase, and you're killing your economy. So, even in terms of efficiency, they are not a good idea. Even for you who decided that you wanted to shut the internet, it is not good. It will not solve any of the problems you're trying to address by shutting down the internet. No, and I think that this is a message that some governments haven't understood. No, and I think that some international bodies, whatever, should tell governments that it's not a bad idea. It is not a good idea. It doesn't solve anything.
So I will add to that, since we had already sort of advocacy, legal avenues addressed. I would add there's technical aspects as well on a sort of user level. Access Now and other organizations are within our Keep It On Coalition Beyond advice to use certain methods. Obviously, as I said, in cases of a complete fundamental shutdown, for example, there is not much you can do except, for example, getting perhaps alternative SIM card. It happened in Ukraine, for example. This is something that we did advise before the full-scale invasion, and in fact, it did help people to get internet when Russia was attacking. And then, but with other types like filtering, DPI, deep packet inspection, shutdowns, DNS manipulation, you could use a VPN or proxy, servers. You can as well, and there are other types as well. For example, say the DDoS attack, then you can use DDoS protection providers to protect your websites and so on. So this is something that is that would be on a case-by-case situation, and we publish those resources proactively in cases like, again, if it's elections or there is a conflict brewing somewhere, we sometimes share, but also if you're an activist, member of civil society, feel free to also contact our digital security helpline to get specific advice as well on circumvention tools.
I would also...
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Well, to the point, Joan, somebody that raised there, and there's a question in here about the Global Digital Compact I saw that was in our chat and pieces. There are people looking to go and put this at a higher, to Joanne's point, raise that to a higher level where in international law and international discussion, how much that, countries can sign that and join to that, how much that actually means is a different question. But there is attention being paid, at least at higher levels, that this is not the right thing. And so I think the more of that we have and the more we elevate that discussion, the better.
Great. So then in the interest of time, I might combine two questions and then you can choose which one you want to approach. One of the questions from the chat was asking, are internet shutdowns can internet shutdowns be a reasonable defensive measure? And then I think similarly related, there's another question that asks, are internet shutdowns starting to be used, referred to in global criminal processes? So are they starting to be used and referenced in courts, and such as the international courts, using internet shutdowns as part of criminal atrocity cases? So one question would be, are internet shutdowns ever a reasonable defensive measure? And are they being used internet shutdowns being used in international courts as a criminal activity?
Defensive measure against what?
I think there's a reference to hate speech. For example, if there's a broad dissemination of hate speech within the context of a genocide going on, whether there's and this is a very, very sensitive matter, because many times I'm asked this by, for example, judges in certain countries, and I'm reluctant to say yes. But the truth is that, I mean, let's say internet shutdowns are not acceptable, are not proportionate, are not necessary in 99.9% of the cases. But I remember once talking to, I mean, it's not me. I mean, I use the authority of the president of at that time, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, that we were together at the panel, and he said, I believe that this is a 0.001% of cases where perhaps an internet shutdown might be justified. But we are talking about extremely exceptional circumstances when there's a genocide going on and the dissemination of speech is taking place online. And that, because also, I mean, hate speech, for example, it's true that hate speech is bad, and hate speech can trigger a genocide, or even, I mean, promote a genocide that is already going on. But if we shut down the internet, we need to take into account that we are also shutting down the counter speech. So we need to be very cautious. So it's very tricky. I mean, again, I don't want to exclude the 0.01, but we need to be extremely, and in many cases, I prefer to lie and say, no, there are no cases where, but in terms of intellectual honesty, perhaps we need to say that there might be perhaps cases, but we need to take into account that when we shut down the internet, we're shutting down everything. So only in cases where basically you only have bad speech, which is difficult to imagine, without no good speech at all, without no possible good use of the internet, then you could consider that. But then you would need to have, I mean, a clear law that says that this can be done. The decision has to be taken by a body that is an independent body. The decision of shutting down the internet has to be clearly established. You say, okay, we're shutting down the internet, but this is not forever. We're shutting down the internet between today at noon and tomorrow at 8 a.m. in the morning. So it's not like we shut down the internet, goodbye. No, it has to be clearly established, and there has to be the possibility of challenging this decision before a certain body. Only in these circumstances we could consider the possibility. Also, apart from hate speech, there's another case we might consider this possibility, but technologically speaking, this is something that I'm not really in the capacity to make sure, to be sure, is that, for example, if there's a cyber attack that uses the internet capacity of a certain country. And this cyber attack may, if we allow this cyber attack to continue to use the internet capacities, it may shut down all the energy sources. It may affect the nuclear power of a certain country, and so that there's a third country controlling everything and sending another country to the Middle Ages because the whole internet is controlled and nothing can work. Well, in that case, of course, in case of such an act of aggression using cyber capacities, this might also, if possible, might also be possible to consider a possible internet shutdown. But again, we are talking about a very, very limited, exceptional circumstances. And I would dare to say, so far, we haven't had a case like that. All the cases of internet shutdowns were not justifiable because they didn't respond to a situation, to an extreme situation like the one that I'm describing.
I agree. I will not add too much to it. Absolutely, I think it is disproportionate. And again, even if you take example of Rwanda, for example, where it was a ruling by the tribunal that the radio was used to incite the genocide, and if in that case you could think, well, government may be justified in throttling the radio, but the radio is not the same as the internet. You don't use radio to send money, to communicate, to escape, to get information on safety and so on. So this is, again, comes down to the proportionality. I will add that about the legal, the use of shutdown as evidence in legal tribunals, international bodies. In fact, we have published recently a legal explainer on, we have documented ICC, at least International Criminal Court, using evidence of shutdowns in Libya as a part of evidence of crimes against humanity. Take a look, crimes against humanity, to take a look at then we encourage courts to use this evidence more. In fact, I just joined this past winter the consultations with the prosecutor, ICC prosecutor on cyber-enabled crimes. His office is working on the policy in this regard, and shutdowns are being discussed quite extensively. So I would expect them to be included in this policy or otherwise referenced. So this is something to keep an eye on.
In light of timeout, I agree with the comments of the others really here.
Great. So actually, this is perfect. I want to give our last panelist about a minute with final remarks. So as a prompting question, after your projects or as your projects continue to be ongoing, where do we go from here? What are the next steps forward, either in terms of research, in terms of practice? Where do we go from here? So Dan, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Well, I guess I would start off by saying let's work toward a world where there aren't internet shutdowns and where the internet is available for everyone all the time in all the forms. I would encourage people to use our Pulse platform. This is why we built it. This is why we staff it. This is what's out there. I would encourage you to go and take a look at it. We have our shutdown incident pages that you can go and promote let people know that this stuff is going on, because it's bringing those elements to light will help basically help people in that kind of form. I mentioned already we have a net loss calculator. We have a section around resilience country reports. We have an active blog that where we talk about shutdowns and also outages. We do there as well. And we're on social media, et cetera. I would encourage you to please use this. Our Kenyan chapter that we used, and the other organizations that work with them, use that net loss as part of their economic argument to the government around why this should not be shut down. That's the kind of thing we love to see, and I would encourage people to take a look. If you're in certain countries, we'll have some journalist workshops coming up, and we would encourage you to look at those as well. You can sign up for our newsletter, all those kind of things, and join us on that. Together, we can shut down the shutdowns, hopefully.
I would like to highlight the threat that we're seeing right now in democracies. Unfortunately, countries like France, United States, Armenia are blocking TikTok, other platforms, and it's something or threatening to block. And this is something that those who live in democracies where we have a voice, we have a vote, we need to really strongly push back against it. There's always some justifications, and again, not to minimize the legitimate concerns about TikTok, and in terms of the national security and privacy and security. However, for example, countries like the United States doesn't have a comprehensive privacy legislation, which we have been calling them on to pass. So perhaps there is a place to start somewhere else and not follow the example of the worst dictatorships in the world. And so this is, I think, we should really focus our efforts, those especially living in those countries, again, push back hard on these new trends.
Well, this is exactly what I was going to say, that we need to look into not only into the usual suspects, but I think that we need to care more about the debates and the conversations that are taking place in countries that are consolidated democracies. I also need to mention the fact that at some point the EU Commissioner Thierry Breton suggested that with the DSA it would be possible to take down at some point, not to take down, but to shut down certain applications in cases of crisis. And it's something that he suggested, saying, oh, it's good news. Now in Europe we can do this thanks to the Digital Services Act, which is not true. The Digital Services Act doesn't allow for this. But I mean, the fact that we're having these discourses coming from top level politicians in Europe, I mean, combined with the so-called Brussels effect, I think that this is a reason for concern, no? Because then you will have other countries saying, look, this is common practice. I mean, even countries that are telling us how things need to be done now, they are doing this as well. So why bother? No. So I think again, looking more into our liberal democracies, if we can still call them like this, it is very urgent.
Well, thank you very much to our expert panelists, and thank you all for joining us. That is the conclusion of our session on internet shutdowns and how to stop them. So thank you all, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.